Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's Training Industry Leader Talk, Building a Learning Culture for Organizational Success, sponsored by Allego, Canvas, Udemy Business, and ROI Training. My name is Emma. I'm a marketing associate here at Training Industry, and I'm so happy you've joined us today. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over to help you interact with our speakers and get the most out of today's session. Throughout today's event, please feel free to use the chat for comments and submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. All of your questions will be addressed during the event or at the end of this program during our Q&A section. When this session ends, a brief survey will pop open in your browser. We really value your feedback and would appreciate it if you could just take a few moments to provide that feedback on the session and the speakers or whatever else is on your mind. And as always, all of our sessions are being recorded and will be archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us with the link to the on-demand sessions. If this is your first Training Industry event, we'd like to welcome you. Training Industry exists to make connections among learning and development professionals. We offer tons of resources to support your role in L&D through live events like today's Leader Talk, as well as through the articles on our website, our magazine. We have conferences, research reports, podcasts, and more. We would really love to hear about what you've learned from today's session on social media. So please follow us on all your favorite platforms so we can continue the conversation there. And now, without any further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. We have Bruce Landry, who is the Chief of Client Experience at Canvas, and Liz McLean, who is the Head of Talent Development at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. We're so happy to have you both here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gonna just replace the screen share here. And can everyone see that?
Looks great.
Fantastic, thank you. So hi everyone, I am Bruce Landry with Canvas, and as Emma just said, we're joined by Liz McLean from Vertex, and we're very excited to explore with you the mindset and systems behind transformative learning cultures. So let's start by taking a look at the world that we're operating in today. There's constant disruption, right? It's the new normal. We talked about a new normal 5 or 10 years ago. The new normal is now disruption all the time. And what we have now is a 20th century hangover where organizations still value control, predictability, and expertise, but they're operating in a 21st century reality of complexity, speed, and ambiguity. And leadership challenges today are really not so much about capability gaps. They're about the pace of change outpacing legacy leadership models. For decades, I think the industry's responded to this by building more programs, more skills, more learning solutions, and while these have created real value, here's the trend that we're seeing across industries. Even excellent learning experiences are being overwhelmed by the systems that leaders are returning to. I'm going to say that again. I think this is a really important point for this segment. Even excellent learning experiences are being overwhelmed by the systems that leaders are returning to. You know what that looks like. Fast decision cycles, meeting overload, pressure for execution, cultural norms being rewarded versus where certainty is rewarded over reflection, as an example. The system pulls leaders back into old patterns, even when these skills exist. I think the question is no longer how do we build better programs? It's how do we build a system of continuous transformation? Why? Because the skills we teach a leader today are often obsolete tomorrow. What leaders really need to know is how to learn and unlearn, and then learn and unlearn again, and then do it over and over and over. Organizational cultures need to pivot to support this reality. What we found in working with organizations, especially post-pandemic, is that leaders succeed or stall based on how they make meaning in a disruptive moment. When their internal story shifts behavior shift. So whatever we develop must help leaders focus on their internal story. And I think sometimes we forget that behavior really follows mindset. Some of the biggest dilemmas we hear leaders struggling with here today, you know what this looks like: conflicting demands, ambiguity, rapid shifts in direction, organizational tension. And I think these generate a real dissonance within leaders, right? I think, I've heard leaders say to us repeatedly, what does this mean for me now? And I think even when we don't hear leaders vocalize this, this is a question that we're all asking ourselves, given the pace of change in the world. Questioning their internal meaning and their story, or maybe even their identity when they ask that question. I think many leaders are asking themselves, how do I respond when none of the old rules apply? I think inside every organization we partner with, we see the same inflection point play out, right? I mean, I think you can all tell your own story about what we're talking about here. So let me just pause for a minute, and I want to bring Liz in from Vertex to share what they're noticing at Vertex.
Yeah.
Liz, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my
Um,
pleasure.
so kind of a two-part question here. I mean, what are the signals that started to surface? I mean, how did you know you needed something deeper than traditional learning?
Yes. Well, it's amazing, Bruce, that you use the language of learn and unlearn, because that's language that our CEO brings to the table to say we're at an inflection point as a company. Vertex is a very successful company that's had a legacy in the R&D space of being really innovative and bringing transformational medicines, particularly in the cystic fibrosis space, and had been very successful at that for years. And now we're on the cusp of great change as an organization, working in multiple different therapeutic areas. So going from, a pretty well-established disease. There's a registry from birth for children with CF, having an incredible product to bring to the market that we continually innovate and are able to bring to those patients, now working in the space of pain, type 1 diabetes,
Yeah.
kidney, sickle cell anemia. So many different areas that the organization is moving into, driven by this excellence in R&D and innovation. And now we're in the space of, how do we really commercialize this? How do we function as an organization that's gone through a huge transformation from one disease area, one therapeutic area, to multiple modalities, multiple therapeutic areas? I mean, the signals are like lighting up left and right
Yeah.
that the
Right.
organization needs to be operating in a different way. And what I'd say is helpful for us is there's real championship of that at the top to say we need to unlearn our old ways of being, of speed at all costs, execute at any price. Now to how do we make sure we're making the right trade-offs? How do we make sure that we're thinking more in an enterprise-wide mindset, that we're really looking at the complexity of being able to bring these therapies forward? And so there's a big signal from our top leadership that this is an area to grow. But I would say what we would also see is we were adding new senior leaders to our organizations, that VP plus population. These new folks are coming in and, have a lot of questions about how we operate and work. And so part of that is also, how do we now continue to bring our great success from the past forward and create the next chapter and the new story together with these new senior leaders that we're bringing in? So we knew we had to change because our business was changing. We were getting signals from leadership itself about, hey, like, how are we operating? What is our story? What is our culture? And how do we move forward?
Yeah. And there's some tension there, right? And maybe let's take a look at that tension and move into more of a systems question. Where did you see the system pulling leaders back into old patterns? Because it's what you just
Yeah.
described, I think probably makes sense to everybody on this call and everybody that will listen to this recording. And then I made this bold statement a few slides ago about how the system eats up those new mindsets and really plays a
Yeah.
significant role in this. What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, even though, just think of ourselves like going on a diet or something. We know that there's a new way of eating and operating and exercising that we should do to get there.
You know,
But it's so easy to know how we've done things in the past and to get wrapped up in it. So it is a continual effort. And what you're talking about of having it be more systemic, having it integrate everybody, that's the only way that we'll get there. But I would say for us, some of the systemic challenges that exist in our organization, that strong legacy and innovation in R&D also comes with deep levels of precision, deep scientific expertise valued at the utmost in our organization.
yeah,
And so that created a space where we need to be looking and examining and vigorously debating scientific information, which is never going to go away. But it also created, the overuse strength type of a situation where are mistakes okay? Can we try something and rapidly change if it doesn't work? How do we work in this more complicated environment? And so that piece of it was a challenge, especially because it had been so successful for so long to operate in this very close-knit, very deeply scientific, precision-based organization to now say, okay, well, where does that happen in the organization? Because we're not losing it.
yeah,
We need to be precise. We need to be innovative. But where do we also look at the places that we can experiment, can make some small mistakes, can move forward with this is good enough to keep all of this great work moving forward and really be able to bring these medicines to patients around the world.
yeah. I love that, and it makes me think about this other question around. I mean, you talked earlier about how the incredible success you had around CF and then moving into new patient therapies and new disease areas. You know, what made you realize you need leaders who can adapt faster, think differently, and influence across boundaries? Because your story is perhaps not unlike a lot of other organizations where you've had wild success doing something at a point in time, and that muscle is not so easily redeveloped because of that success. I mean, we could argue that our success is sometimes our worst enemy because we kind of think that that's the way it's going to go moving forward. When did you, or how did you realize that?
I mean, this is a story of really great innovation in our organization and having to work in these different environments and contexts. Nothing is more clear than like, oh, now we're working in the space of pain. There's many different competitors in this market. The way that we reach patients who are experiencing acute pain is totally different than we would reach them in another way. And so by the nature of our work, and by the nature of our mission, which is to not just build transformational medicines, but like get them into bodies to
Yeah,
make the world a better place,
right.
we've got to be able to think differently. And one of the biggest areas I think that came out for Vertex is more in that enterprise-wide mindset. It was really the
Yeah,
pressure against we can create really interesting breakthroughs in science. But what does that then look like from a manufacturing standpoint? What does that look like in terms of how we would do the clinical trial? How would we actually get this to a point where we can bring it and have payers reimburse for it? What does it actually look like beyond the approval of
yeah,
this drug to the then commercialization aspect of it? And when you think about that commercialization space, it's not just, oh, we got the approval, now we'll figure out all of these next steps at stage gates in the process to think about what's going to be the value of this to society? How are we going to get it to people? What's the impact that it's going to bring? And start making some more of those trade-offs around, is this what we want to make our next bet on? How do we have more of that end-to-end thinking in place? So I think that was really the impetus, is how do we help leaders move from I'm in my functional line, I can look at this particular asset, or innovation and get it to the end of my functional line and pass it off to now I'm a leader in an organization and I have to be able to understand the full scope of this and what it's going to look like in reality and start pressure testing that earlier on in the system. So that's like our reality is getting leaders to think more in that way. But then there's everything else happening in the world with
Right.
introduction of AI, disruptions potentially in supply chain, shifts in what's happening on a macroeconomic level. All of those things add layers of complexity and layers of opportunity on the AI front that we need to be thinking about. And so that broader thinking is really not just limited to, this piece of how do we look at our products more end to end and the possibilities, but also how do we really lift our heads up more than we have in the past to understand what's happening around us and be pulling things in. I think that, old Vertex maybe was really focused internally on innovation. How do we get these great minds really creating innovation that's going to drive us forward? And now, how are we also making sure that we've got the right balance of focusing on the internal innovation with a better understanding of what's going on around
Yeah,
us?
that makes a lot of sense. I think, you know, what you're sharing for me really reinforces
Mhm.
that the challenges that we're facing today really require an important shift, and it's a mindset shift, right? Where learning has to move away from this concept of delivering content to understanding what it means to build capacity. And you just gave many examples of that in sharing the story at Vertex. I think so. What we're talking about here is moving away from just upskilling to helping leaders understand why these skills are important, right? It's not just about competencies alone. It's about what drives the need for these competencies and helping leaders really get underneath the why, what it means for them. And if we want people to operate at that enterprise mindset level, then we need to do the work to help them understand the bigger picture, not just drop behaviors or competencies or skills development. And then I think, the other thing that comes up for me here is around so many organizations focus on particular leadership level programs instead of thinking about the entire leadership ecosystem. And you just gave some great examples around that, not just around the functions and the process through which you would go from R&D to helping a patient have a better life to how leaders need to work together across boundaries and to have that enterprise mindset, right?
Yeah.
So, an effective learning culture today, the way we look at it is we need to really focus on three critical capacities. And it starts with meaning making. And you just gave great examples of that. We talked about a little bit earlier, but that ability to pause, that ability to interpret what's changing around us, that, we, I don't know how many times we've said fast paced and move quickly, and we've used a lot of language even thus far in the webinar to talk about how fast things are moving. But what we're really talking about is the opposition to that of actually going slower to be able to respond to that, right? So slowing down, that pausing, that reflecting, and then allowing a new vision of what's possible to emerge, right? Even in the midst of that disruption. So much so that we get excited or motivated about the possibility. I mean, that vision really has us. And it compels us to not just take action, but I think it gets us to a place where we want to refine and sustain new ways of working. And if we can get our leadership teams, if we can get our leadership levels to embrace those three capacities, then a lot opens up for our abilities to compete and be successful as organizations, right? So, the opportunity here perhaps is to create a learning culture inside organizations where reflection is normalized, where leaders are prepared for navigating and sitting in tension, ambiguity, complexity, where learning is integrated into the rhythm of daily work, not seen as an event, but more as learning as a core capacity, if you will. it's going to take a shift in leadership thinking. And we'll need to build a shared language, and we'll need to measure more than just skills. What we'll need to do is understand and develop our transformative capacity. And I think that statement right there for us is absolutely critical to creating a learning culture. So I think what we're talking about here is leaders being able to reframe situations quickly, to get inside their own stories quickly and adapt them to influence a bigger ecosystem. And I think that idea of getting inside our story, that idea of even asking ourselves the question, what is my bias or what is my story around this disruption or this change? What is my story around my ability to reinvent myself in a new way so that I can respond as a leader to what my people in the organization need? So, Liz, I'm going to pull you in again. We want to hear
Yeah,
some more Vertex stories here.
sure.
Um, so, what we'd like to kind of understand here a little bit more, perhaps, is, add a little more of the transformative story within Vertex and how in its leadership development, right? And what did that look like? So, I guess maybe the first thing I'm curious about is, what do you think was the shift in your leaders as they move through this work? Because it's not
Mhm.
easy work when we start looking at our
Yeah.
identities and our bias and start to really confront and challenge the stories that maybe even have made us successful to this point, and we challenge whether or not those stories are still valid.
Yeah.
Um, that's not light work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the most common thing that I hear from folks that have gone through this transformational learning program so far is the power of learning to pause and like the value that that really creates in our environment. It's a culture that moves quickly. We debate vigorously. We've got a drive for excellence. And that can result in people just moving, moving, moving. Okay, let's realign and move forward very quickly. And then intentionality to say, what happens when you don't? We just like give you a challenge to think about and we don't let you go to solutioning. Sit in that uncomfortable moment of unknowing and really explore what that can look like. My own leader went through the program and she started to practice that with us, and it generates new. And it also is generating what our most senior leaders are looking for, where they're saying, I need you to look around the corners more. Don't just give me the answer.
Yeah.
Come back and help me understand what's happening around each of the corners. And did you think about this and that? And it's that shift from, okay, I came, I gave you A, now you're asking me to think about B and C. I'll go think about B and C. To, I came and gave you A, you're asking me to think differently. I'm going to pause and just explore for a while
Yeah.
without immediately getting into action. That's really the biggest shift that we're looking for, is how do we move away from action, action, action to let's really understand where we are and do the scanning that we need to and look around those corners, because we're dealing with an environment that is complex, that is ambiguous. And our leaders struggle with it because that's not really the way that people are generally recognized for their
Sure.
success.
Yeah, that's
They
it.
have technical expertise, they have a depth. I mean, our Vertex leaders are world class, right? Like they are
For sure.
coming with decades of incredible experience, incredible expertise, asked to bring that to the table in a fast-paced environment. And that discipline of pausing and bringing others into the conversation is challenging. So that's one that I would mention. The other one is related, which the second thing that we get the best feedback from this work is about creating the container where these senior leaders talk to one another. And like they're the ones who are dealing with same levels of challenges in totally different universes, right? You've
Right.
got accounting, global security, and someone reading a research organization. And but the level of the challenges and the complexities that they're dealing with are on par. And they don't take that time to necessarily phone a friend and just chat through what's happening,
Right.
and that was one of the most powerful experiences here is building those relationships and building their comfort with one another to reach out and talk about high level complexities that they're dealing with and get some of those ideas about how might you approach it or what might you think of. They're so hungry for that connection and that shared learning. When you talk about a learning ecosystem, what's more powerful than learning from one another, from people who have been operating in this organization, who can look at it from different angles, who have been in that space? It's so powerful to be able to build more of that ecosystem of connection so they can share those challenges and continue to talk about them.
Yeah, I love that. And again, I think there's an undercurrent of what you're sharing there that talks about slowing down, right?
Yeah.
Building relationships and having meaningful dialogue. All of those things require us to pause, slow down, do things with intention, fail fast, right? And as you said, a lot of us have been rewarded and got to where we are today because we had the right answer fast over time.
Mhm.
And so this idea of embracing failing fast, this idea of embracing the joy of being wrong, if you will,
Mhm.
in service of getting to right or to a better right, is not something that a lot of leaders are comfortable with. It's going to take some work. Um, I'm curious around, you talked about your experience with your leader and some of
Mhm.
the leadership team, maybe looking at the broader organization with other stories you may have heard. What would you say has transformed the most? Skills, the stories, the system, something else
Yeah.
entirely, all of the above?
I think there's more openness and a mindset shift that has happened with the folks who've been a part of this program. So, for those of you on the webinar, we are in the process of rolling this out over time, and have had maybe a third of our senior leaders experience one of these. Our program with Canvas. There are other ways that we support and nurture our senior leaders along the way. But you can really see that for folks who have started to participate in this, some of those pieces have shifted, like the desire to stay more in the scanning phase of things and like figure out what's really going on as opposed to jumping to solution and understanding like how do I look more around those corners, as opposed to leaping directly into action. That's had some staying power with that group. And just that story of how to be successful, I don't think it's changed immediately in our
Right.
organization. These folks are never going to give up being world-class experts in what they do. And that's not where we're headed. But I do think that that shift to how do I, as a leader, create the space and the container for my groups to pause before just jumping into action? Because those that behavior just trickles down in the organization. And we've seen lots of leaders request Canvas come in and help their broader teams
Yeah.
understand some of these concepts around leading in complexity, really pausing to think before jumping into action. I think they've recognized how powerful that is and how much we need it to be successful. We need to be able to make the space to pause and to hear from others, to do that scanning, and they want to bring that skill throughout the organization. So I'm quite optimistic that we'll get there over time.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing, thank you for sharing that, is, if we're going to help create a learning culture, if we're going to help leaders make that shift, then we have to look at the system. We can't do a one-off program. We can't do a particular leadership band and expect the whole system of the culture to shift. So I think that's a really important point that you're making there is whatever that modality is, whether you run it internally or you leverage a partner like Canvas or however you need to do that, is finding a way to make incremental, if nothing else, shifts across the entire system at the functional level, at the leadership level, at the executive level, etc. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for that. Um, you know, I think what's fascinating in working with your people is who are moving 100 miles an hour. I'm not sure I've ever seen a group of leaders that are moving as fast as your team. And how much they appreciated that framework of pausing and that framework of reflecting and that framework of exploring and expanding their perspective and their bias and their story with others. Um, in a way, I think we could say that we were installing learning as the engine of transformation within Vertex, right? And as we think about learning, maybe we could even call it a core operating system. And uh, as we think about disrupting leadership in the 21st century, I think it's important that we remember that reflection, curiosity, are now critical capacities alongside feedback to anchor into continuous transformation. And we've talked about curiosity now for a while as an industry. Feedback's always been there. And it's that reflection word that I keep coming back to, because I think if we were to swoop up a group of cross-industry leaders and we ask them the question, hey, do you reflect? I'm pretty sure the answer would be, yeah, you bet. I reflect all the time. But do we do that critical, deeper reflection around self, our stories, our identity? Do we really go deep to get underneath what the foundational components are to how we're approaching disruption? And, when we put learning at the center of leadership development, then we can see, an increase in their adaptability to, adapt faster, to sit in complexity. We see teams being able to calibrate and align more easily. Culture becomes a driver of momentum. Disruption is seen and valued as a competitive advantage. And I think that's a pretty strong statement, because I think a lot of organizational cultures try to minimize disruption. If you think about that 20th century, called it a hangover, where stability and precision and certainty and all those things that might make us more comfortable don't really exist anymore, whether we like it or not. So this idea of disrupting ourselves instead of something on the outside of our organizations disrupting us is really important. And I think those organizations that can do that really are leveraging a competitive advantage within their space. So I think what we're talking about here is learning as a cultural norm inside organizations, so that transformation, it's not seen as a project, but a normal aspect of staying future ready. And I think we see so many initiatives, right? We see so many programs, initiatives that get stood up, but they're not adopted by the system. They're not adopted by the culture. They sit outside the larger culture, and we put resource against that, and that's people's time. We put budgets against that. And it's important that we look at that transformation, and we look at that culture of learning as something that really needs to be embedded. I think we're going to get into some Q&A here in a minute, but I think one of the things that I want to leave you with is, it doesn't really matter where you start in your own organization. It could be leadership development. It could be culture transformation. Maybe it's coaching engagements or talent strategy. Your entry point into transformation is in some ways irrelevant. We might have a preference of where we'd like to start, but whether it's the industry or the market or our own organizations, we don't often get the luxury of deciding that entry point. So what we're encouraging you to do here is leverage whatever entry point presents itself for you, and try to approach any of these as gateways into creating a learning culture. Approach any of these as the opportunity, because each will build upon the other. So want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to pause there. We've got about 10 minutes left. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Emma. Any questions?
We do have a handful. All right, I'm going to start with this one. You spoke about transformative capacity as something leaders can build, but can it be measured? And if so, what are you seeing across the industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, can it be measured? Yes, transformative capacity can be measured. It's an underlying muscle. I think, that muscle is measurable through mindset, through narrative moves, and through observable behavior. I mean, many of our clients are trying to assess this right now. Canvas is piloting a new measurement approach with our partners, and it's a tool in which you can measure your transformative capacity. And I think the field is shifting towards that mindset, right? And I think, this is another example of where we might get a little bit uncomfortable with some of this because, we like to measure things often in quantifiable ways. And I think, mindset is something that's not so easily quantifiable. So I think it's about us getting comfortable with approaching our assessments and building out something that measures things in a very different way.
Excellent. You've talked about leaders being pulled back to the system's baseline. How do organizations change that baseline, and what enables a true learning culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we talked about that some here already. I mean, the baseline shifts when the stories shift, right? I mean, when leaders normalize reflection, when they normalize curiosity, and they are comfortable and consistently adopt an iterative approach to leading to success, right? I mean, it is, if we're going to succeed in complexity, then we have to be okay with failing fast, right? We have to be okay with experimentation. We have to be okay with not knowing and experimenting with it. When learning's embedded into the rhythm of work I think is another important aspect of that. It's important that leaders don't see learning as performative, as something that you do when somebody's looking, but it really gets embedded in, to your example, Liz, it gets embedded into your meetings. It gets embedded into how you interact with others. And I think it gets embedded in the hallways and in the waiting rooms of Zoom calls and in the elevator and in the parking garages, metaphorically or otherwise, when these are not formal opportunities, right? It's something that we really own as a culture. And when the system rewards meaning making instead of speed, I think is another important piece of that. It's important that if we want to move faster, we have to develop the perhaps counterintuitive muscle of slowing down and reflecting. And then finally, I guess what I would add to that is that when leaders model and multiply those behaviors, that's important. Everybody on this call can think of examples where people go into programs, they learn new mindsets, new behaviors, new skills, what have you. And then they don't really model that when they come out of the program. And I think that one point also speaks to, it's a leadership ecosystem. So it's not enough to take your senior leaders or your mid-level leaders or your frontline leaders or even the executive team and do work around transformative learning or do work around developing your transformative capacity and then expect that to just magically cascade through the rest of the organization. You have to put the time into the whole ecosystem.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of examples that I think have been great at Vertex in this space, where we do have a program that I would say is a real engine around this transformation with Canvas. And we have about 30 people go through it at a time. There's other things that are happening in that surround sound. But what I would mention about this that I think is really helpful in creating this new learning environment is one, we have executive committee members come and they teach the models that we're talking about by telling stories of how they've overcome leading in complexity, about where they used enterprise-wide mindset and when it didn't work. And so having them share their stories and how they're making sense of those concepts is that additional way of reframing these stories getting a look under the hood of how our most senior level leaders are doing it. And then the other thing that I think is building a lot of momentum, because I think many of you out there probably are like, we're going to get all of our senior leaders through at once into this transformational program where they think differently as a result of it. It's actually been quite nice having them go in cohorts. One, because it feels special for the group that's together. They get quite connected. But then it's like the continual drip of this content and the words and the new practices back into the organization.
Yeah.
So there might be an incredible momentum for the next couple of months from participants of really trying to use these skills and approaches. And then, life comes back and you have to either remember to get on your Peloton bike and keep biking or like you stop doing it. But when you've got new people who are starting to get excited about this way of thinking and these new practices, it re-injects the environment with that enthusiasm, and you're just building consistency and maintaining that energy. So I think that was a positive outcome for us that maybe I wouldn't have anticipated at the outset.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to add a piece to what Liz just shared because not only are the executive team members coming in and teaching the content and literally being a part of the program, but they're entering the program, sharing their stories, and the humility of not just when they've executed well on whatever the model is that they're teaching, whether that's enterprise mindset, um, that's our three lens model, but there's just different things that they come in and teach. But they come in and they teach examples in their career where they have not done it well. And to just really be vulnerable and to share those stories with others and to just, you know, generate we talk about psychological safety all the time, but to have an executive leader, to have a member of the executive committee and talk about, let me give you an example of when I tried to do this and it was a total failure and it was and this was the outcome, right? And to allow the participants in the program to then ask questions around it. That's powerful stuff.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Okay.
And this one's about AI, which everybody is thinking about.
Yeah.
With AI accelerating so quickly, what remains uniquely human? And where does leadership development need to focus?
Right. No, that's no small question there. I love the question. We're all talking about it. And what's interesting is that, if you ask 10 people that question, you don't get the same answer, right? I think if I were to think about that question, I think, AI can simulate intelligence, and it's fantastic. It can level up your grammar. It can do all kinds of things. It can give you answers. It's a more interactive Google, if you will. There are a lot of advantages of AI. But what it really can't do is it can't make meaning. It really can't wrestle with identity. It really can't navigate tension. It doesn't feel context. It doesn't create stories. So there are those are some critical aspects that I think are, at least at the moment, uniquely human. And critical to creating an effective learning culture and one built around transformation. I think the human advantage is we reflect. Um, we're interpretive and we have a narrative based intelligence, and we learn through story. So while we can get answers very easily from AI, it doesn't do so well with that narrative-based intelligence. It doesn't do so well with helping us with the story around that. I mean, learning must shift from teaching skills to cultivating meaning. And that is something that's still uniquely human. I think that's why transformative capacity really matters, not just as a program, but as a leadership identity.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bruce. We are out of time, out of questions. Thank you both so much, Bruce and Liz, for joining us. It's been a fabulous session. I think our attendees got a lot out of it. They seem to be thrilled in the chat, so that's great.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Up next, we have a 15-minute break. And then we have Dr. Tom Whalen, who is the Director of Corporate Research here at Training Industry. He's doing a session with Udemy Business titled Contents Under Pressure, Sustaining a Learning Culture in Times of Change. In just a moment, I'm going to end this session. You will have a survey pop open in your browser, like I said, so please give us some feedback. We really appreciate that. And you can join our next session at the top of the hour by returning to the event lobby and going to the Sessions tab. I'll see you all in the next one. Have a great day.